The Amish woman wrapped her greenhouse in old blankets until it grew food under snow. At dusk in the last week of January 1936, if you had stood on the Kelowna Road and looked south past the Schrock place, you would have seen something that made no sense at all. Behind the barn, low against its south wall, a little lean-to shed made of mismatched window sashes was glowing a faint, warm gold. Not from a lamp inside it, but from the low winter sun caught and held behind the glass. And over the top of it, tied down at the corners against the wind, were what looked, from the road, like a heap of old quilts. Because that is exactly what they were. Snow lay 2 feet deep on the level and drifted to a man's shoulder along the fences. The thermometer nailed to the Schrock porch post had not climbed above 0 in 9 days. And under 2 feet of Iowa snow, under a roof made of a dead man's storm windows and a quilting bee's cast-offs, Lovina Schrock's little glass shed held green things. Lettuce, spinach, a short thick row of parsley still standing. Her own 5 children had eaten a green vegetable in some form on every single day of that killing cold snap. In the farmhouses up and down that road, most children had not seen anything green since October. Within 3 weeks, that difference would matter more than anyone in the district could have guessed on the night this story starts, which was a much smaller, much sadder night, 10 months earlier, in the spring of 1935. Stay with me. This one is not about a clever gadget behind a barn. It is about what a woman does after she has watched her own child get sick from something nobody in the settlement had a name for. If you like these, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. To understand the quilt-covered shed, you first have to understand a Tuesday in April of 1935, and a boy named Amos who was 7 years old. Amos Shrock had been tired all that March. Not sick tired, just slow, listless, off his food, bruising if you so much as caught his arm helping him down off a wagon. His gums had started to bleed when Lovina cleaned his teeth of an evening, a little pink on the cloth that she told herself was nothing. And then one morning he could not get up. His knees and ankles had swollen and gone tender in the night, and he cried when Dan tried to help him stand. And there was no explaining it, because nothing had bitten him, and nothing had broken, and he had no fever to speak of. They sent for the doctor in Kelowna, a town doctor named Reeves, who had cared for plain families up and down that road for 20 years, and had seen most things twice. He came out through the mud of a late thaw, examined the boy for a long while, and asked Lovina questions that seemed at first to have nothing to do with anything. What had the boy been eating all winter? Not what he liked. What there had actually been on the table, day after day, since November. She told him, and it was the truth, and it was no different from any other house on that road. Salt pork and side meat, potatoes all winter, every way a potato can be fixed, cornmeal, the dried apples and the canned green beans and the crocks of sauerkraut and pickled things put up the fall before, going thin by March the way a cellar always does. Bread and more bread. Nothing fresh, nothing had been fresh in the plain sense of green and growing and just picked, since the garden gave out at the first hard frost. Dr. Reeves told her something she had genuinely never heard put into words before, though every farm woman in that kitchen had lived beside the truth of it her whole life without a name for it. He told her there were things in fresh green food. He used the word vitamins, a word barely 5 years old in ordinary speech at that point, still strange on a country doctor's tongue, that a body needed and could not make for itself, and could not get from a root cellar full of the best-kept potatoes in the county. A winter with nothing green in it, he said, especially a long one, especially on a child, could do exactly what he was looking at in that swollen knee and that bleeding gum. It was not new. Sailors had known some rough cousin of it for 300 years, on ships with nothing fresh aboard for months at a stretch. Now and then, in a hard winter, on an isolated farm, on a diet that was entirely stored and dried and salted, it came ashore. He told her Amos needed greens and oranges if she could get them, and that he would come right in the spring, and that the swelling and the bleeding would very likely mend on their own the moment fresh food was back on the table. He was right. By the middle of May, with the garden up and the first lettuce and the first wild greens along the fence rows, Amos was climbing the hay mow again like nothing had happened. But Lovina Schrock did not forget the sound he'd made trying to stand, or the 2 months it had taken the roads to dry enough for a doctor to reach them in March, or the plain, simple, terrible arithmetic underneath the whole thing. Every winter, on every farm on that road, there were 7 months, call it October to May, when nothing green grew. And a body could go 7 months on stored food and mostly get by. But not every body did, not every year. And when it went wrong exactly the way it had gone wrong in her own kitchen, with a doctor 20 muddy miles away and a boy who could not stand. She decided, sometime in that month, in a plain and undramatic way, that this would not happen in her house again. Not because anyone told her to, because she had heard her son cry trying to stand on his own 2 legs, and she was the kind of woman who, having heard a thing like that once, arranges her whole life so as never to hear it again. Now, what do you do about 7 months with no green growing on an Iowa farm in 1935, with no money for coal to heat a proper glass house and no interest whatsoever, hers or the church's, in owning something so worldly as a heated conservatory? You do not fight the winter. You borrow heat from 3 different places that were already sitting on the farm for free, and you stack them. The first was the sun itself, which does more work in January than most people give it credit for, if you only give it something to push against. Lovina had Dan pull the good sashes off 2 windows in the old house before he replaced them that fall. Glass Dan's father had glazed by hand 30 years before, along with a scatter of other odd storm window sash bought for pennies off a neighbor tearing down a shed. She had him build her a lean-to frame against the south wall of the barn. The barn wall itself doing real work here, because a barn wall that has stood in the sun all day holds warmth into the evening, the way a stone holds the heat of a fire, and facing due south so that every clear day, however cold the air, the low winter sun would come in almost level through that glass and land square on the beds inside. Glass lets the sun's light in and then makes it hard for the heat that light turns into to get back out again. That is the whole trick of a greenhouse, old as glass itself, and it is why, even on a bitter, bright January afternoon, the inside of a south-facing glass box can stand 40 degrees warmer than the air 3 feet outside it. The second heat she borrowed was not from the sky at all. It was from the barn itself, or rather, from what came out of the barn every morning in the wheelbarrow. Fresh manure, packed and left to itself, does not sit there inert. It works. The same kind of small, unseen, furious life that turns cider into vinegar turns a heap of fresh manure and bedding straw into something that generates its own heat as it breaks down. A compost pile in the middle of December, dug into a pit and packed 2 feet deep, will run hot enough on its own, from nothing but the busy work of what is living and multiplying inside it, to keep frost off a bed of soil laid over the top of it for weeks on end. Gardeners in the old country had used exactly this trick for 200 years to raise vegetables through a European winter under exactly this name, a hotbed, though nobody in that Iowa settlement had ever built one, because nobody in that settlement had ever needed lettuce in January quite this badly before. The third heat she borrowed was heat she already owned, and simply had not thought to spend this way. The heat of the day itself, saved. On a clear day, the glass caught the sun and the beds beneath ran warm, but glass loses at night almost as fast as it gains by day. A clear black winter sky will pull the day's warmth straight back out through a pane of glass faster than almost anything else can rob you of it. What Lovina understood, and what half the district thought was funny enough to talk about at the mill, was that the fix for that was sitting in a chest in her own front room, Every evening, when the light went, she and the older children went out and threw old quilts and worn wool blankets, the ones gone too thin or too outdated for a bed, the ones any other house would have cut up for rag rugs, clear across the sloped glass roof of that little shed, and weighted the edges down against the wind. A quilt cannot make heat, but it can trap a day's worth of borrowed heat in, the same slow, simple way it keeps a sleeping child warm. And by morning, pulled back off at first light, it had held the whole bed above freezing through nights that stood 20 below in the open air outside. Sun by day, manure by night and day both, and an old quilt to keep the day's gift from leaking away after dark. None of it was clever on its own. Every piece of it alone was a thing that Farm already had lying around for some other purpose. What Lovina Schrock did that summer and fall of 1935 was simply the work of stacking 3 ordinary things that nobody else on that road had thought to stack. It did not go right the first time, and it is worth telling you how it went wrong, because the wrong way is at least as instructive as the right one. In September, eager to have the beds running before the first hard frost, Dan dug the pit behind the barn wall and filled it with fresh manure straight from the morning mucking out, packed it down, and Lovina laid her soil over the top the same afternoon and put her first seedlings of lettuce and spinach straight into it. That evening, pleased with how quick the work had gone. By the second morning, every seedling in that bed was dead. Not frozen, cooked. A pit of fresh manure packed that deep does not warm gently. In its first days, it runs hot, hot enough to scald a root and give off a sharp, biting reek of ammonia that will burn a young plant faster than any frost could. She had built, without meaning to, a small underground furnace, and she had planted her garden directly on top of the firebox while it was still roaring. She pulled the whole bed apart, disgusted with herself, and thought about it for the better part of a week, which tells you something about the kind of person she was, that her answer to failure was to sit with it rather than to abandon it. And what she came to was patience, which is the answer to most things in a garden and most things outside one too. The pit needed to be dug and packed and then left alone, covered but unplanted, for a good 10 days to 2 weeks, to let that first violent heat burn itself down to something steadier and milder. What she came to call, and what old country gardeners had always called, letting the bed sweeten. Only once the worst of that first fever had passed, once you could hold your bare hand flat against the soil above it and count to 10 without pulling back, was it fit to plant into. After that, the pit would run warm, and even for a long stretch, weeks, sometimes more than a month, if it was built deep and generous, a slow, banked, patient kind of heat, instead of that first furious one. She rebuilt it that way in early October, waited out her 10 days doing nothing but watching a heap of manure, and planted into it cold and even. That bed lived. Of course, the whole district had opinions before a single seed went into that second correct bed, because a district always does. There was no single man standing at a fence with 3 sharp objections, the way there might have been over a stranger idea. What there was, instead, was a kind of low, steady, good-natured ribbing that followed Lovina Schrock through that whole fall. The sort that is almost harder to answer than real hostility, because there is nothing in it worth arguing with. Dan's older brother Willis thought it was a waste of good bedding straw and good glass on a patch of greens the size of a quilt, when there was real work a man's hands could be put to. At Sunday singing, the young people called it Lovina's window garden, not unkindly, the way you'd tease a woman for keeping a house too clean. Somebody's grandmother was heard to say, with a small shake of the head, that grass was for cows and no Christian child needed to eat green things in January that the Lord himself had not seen fit to grow in January. And when the quilts started going up over that glass roof every evening at dusk, a few of the men driving past in the last of the light took to calling the little shed, with real affection and no real respect at all, the old lady's bed, as if the shed itself had been tucked in for the night, which, in every way that mattered, it had. Lovina did not argue with any of it. She fed her children a green vegetable at nearly every supper straight through that fall and into the worst of the winter, and she let the district have its joke, and she kept her quilts folded by the shed door, ready to go out at dusk and come back in at first light, and she waited, the way you wait when you already know something the people laughing don't. What came in February of 1936 was not an ordinary hard winter. Across a wide belt of the middle of the country that month set records that in some places have never since been broken. A cold that did not merely dip hard for a night or two and let go, but that settled in and sat, day after day, week after week, the thermometer barely climbing above zero even at noon and falling to 20 and 30 below after dark. The roads out of Kelowna drifted shut and stayed shut. Coal was short and dear in a country still climbing out of the worst of the Depression, and every household on that road pulled in tight around whatever fire it could keep fed and rationed whatever was left in the cellar, because nobody was getting to town and nobody was getting fresh anything, and this went on not for a week, but very nearly for the whole of that month. And this is the part of the story that is not really about Lovina Schrock's cleverness at all, and I think it is the more important part. What that long record cold did was recreate, on a much larger scale and all at once, up and down that whole road, the exact narrow situation that had put her own son on his back the spring before. Weeks and weeks of nothing but stored food, in houses that could not get out to buy anything fresh even if there had been money for it, going on longer and harder than any ordinary winter ever had. By the third week of February, 2 other families on that road had a child down with the same slow, swollen, bleeding gummed sickness Amos had carried the spring before, and Dr. Reeves, when at last a sledge could get through to fetch him, told those families precisely what he had told Lovina 10 months earlier, because it was precisely the same thing. Lovina Schrock's cellar, by the third week of February, held something almost nobody else on that road had: a standing, ongoing, daily supply of fresh green food, growing quietly under 2 feet of snow behind a barn wall, wrapped in bedding through the coldest nights that belt of the country had seen in living memory. Her own children had never gone a single week that winter without it, and when word came which families had a sick child, she did not wait to be asked. She sent baskets, lettuce, spinach, the last of a row of parsley, whatever the beds were given that week, carried over by sledge through the drifts to 2 kitchens that had nothing fresh in them at all, and kept sending them every few days for as long as that cold sat on the country. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to hand you a tidier ending than the truth will bear. A basket of garden greens carried over by sledge twice a week did not by itself cure anything overnight, and Dr. Reeves had other things in his bag besides Lovina's lettuce, and both of those sick children mended the way Amos had mended, slowly, over weeks, as the fresh food built back up what a whole winter of stored food had worn down. But it mended faster, and it mended with less fear in those 2 kitchens, for the simple reason that fresh green food did not have to wait for the roads to thaw or the trains to run before it reached them. It was already there, 30 minutes up the road, growing under a heap of old quilts, on a farm that had thought about this exact problem, quietly and without fuss, the better part of a year before anybody needed it to. By spring, nobody in that district was calling it the old lady's bed anymore, not because there was some grand public reckoning. There was no meeting, no notice in a church letter, nothing set down anywhere that historians could later point to. What happened was smaller and, in its way, more lasting than a public reckoning would have been. The women started coming by, not the men, mostly, and not in any organized way, and not all at once, one at a time, the way Rachel Beeler had once started coming to Susanna Troyer's kitchen for a different reason entirely. The wives and the older daughters up and down that road began stopping at the Schrock place on some other errand and staying to look at the glass shed and ask a question or two, and then another question the next time. and Lovina, who had never once tried to make a case for what she'd built, answered every one of them plainly. The sweetening of the bed and the pitch of the glass and the folding of the quilts. And by the fall of 1936, there were 3 more hotbeds behind 3 more barns on that road, built a little differently each time to suit each yard, none of them announced, none of them written down. That is, in the end, the whole shape of how this kind of knowledge has always moved in a community like that one. And it is worth saying plainly instead of prettying it up. It did not go into a farm journal. No agricultural agent ever drove out to see it and write it up for a bulletin, the way they might have if a man had built it. It moved the way so much of the real, working knowledge that has kept plain households fed and well for 200 years has always moved. Kitchen to kitchen, one woman explaining it to the next while they stood over the same bed of lettuce in the cold. No one's name attached to it, no credit sought or given, just a thing that worked, passed along because it worked. Drive the back roads around Kelowna today, in a hard January, and here and there behind a barn you will still find a low glass lean-to with an old quilt folded by the door, waiting for dusk. Most of the women tending them could not tell you whose idea it first was. They only know it works, the way their mothers' mothers knew it worked, which is exactly how Lovina Schrock would have wanted it left. She never asked for the credit, and the district never quite got around to giving it to her, and I don't think either one of those facts would have surprised her or troubled her much. What she had wanted, on that Tuesday in April of 1935 when her son could not stand up on his own 2 legs, was never to be thanked. It was only ever this, that no mother on that road would ever again have to listen to that particular sound and count the muddy miles to the doctor and wonder if green things could be made to grow under 2 feet of Iowa snow. They could. She had already worked out how, a year ahead of the need, with nothing but old glass, a wheelbarrow, and a chest of quilts too worn for anybody's bed. If this one stayed with you, tell me in the comments, and tell me the longest stretch you've ever gone without something fresh. There is more where this came from. The quiet fixes, the unrecorded knowledge, and the people who solved a problem a year before anyone else knew it was coming. What you have heard is a told story, shaped for the telling. The people and the exact place in it are invented. The winter of 1936, the science of vitamins as it was understood at the time, and the old real practice of warming a garden bed with glass, borrowed sunlight, fermenting manure, and a blanket thrown over it at dusk are not.